The distant howl of a lone wolf carried across the darkening Montana sky as Grace Collins clutched her father's pocket watch, her only inheritance, running breathlessly toward the barn. The year was 1883, and at 22, she had never expected to find herself fleeing from three men who wanted more than just the silver timepiece she protected against her rapidly beating heart. She went that way. A gruff voice called out, followed by the sound of boots crunching on the dry dirt of the ranch, where Grace had been working as a bookkeeper for the past 8 months. The vast expanse of the Lazy P Ranch had seemed like salvation when Grace had arrived from Boston after her father's death. With no family and few prospects in the city, the advertisement seeking someone with mathematical aptitude and neat penmanship had been her chance at a new beginning in the Montana Territory. The owner, elderly Mrs. Patterson, had been kind enough to hire a woman when most would have expected a male accountant, and Grace had thrived in the rustic surroundings despite her Eastern upbringing. Until tonight, 3 riders had arrived at dusk, claiming to be cattle buyers. Grace had been alone in the main house, with Mrs. Patterson away visiting her daughter in Helena, and most of the ranch hands out with the herd. Something about the men had unsettled her immediately, their shifting eyes, the way they examined every corner of the room, and how the leader's gaze had fixed upon the safe in Mrs. Patterson's office. When they'd made their intentions clear, demanding she open the safe containing the ranch's earnings from the recent cattle sale, Grace had fled. She knew the combination, but she also knew what would likely happen to her once they had the money. Now the autumn night was falling fast as Grace slipped into the barn, her gray dress catching on the rough-hewn door. She pulled it free with a soft rip and moved deeper into the shadowy interior, the familiar smell of hay and horses offering small comfort as she sought a hiding place. "Check the barn," another voice called, closer now. Grace's breath caught in her throat as she moved behind a stack of hay bales. The barn was large but offered few places to hide effectively. She looked desperately around at the horse stalls, the tack room, the loft above all potential hiding spots, but all easily searched by determined men. The heavy barn door creaked open, spilling a sliver of the last evening light across the dirt floor. Grace pressed herself against the rear wall, wedging her slight frame between hay bales and a wooden support beam. Her hands trembled as she heard boots scuffing against the ground, coming closer. "Come on out, pretty lady," a voice drawled. "We know you're in here. Just tell us the combination to that safe, and maybe we'll let you live." The laughter that followed told Grace exactly how empty that promise was. She had seen their faces clearly enough to identify them later if there was a later. Her throat tightened as she realized they couldn't afford to leave witnesses. "Found tracks leading in here," another voice said. "She ain't gone nowhere else." Grace closed her eyes, offering a silent prayer. There were 3 of them, armed, and nowhere for her to run. The ranch house was too far to make a dash for it, and even if she could reach her small cabin behind the cookhouse, she had nothing there to defend herself with. "I see something moving," the first voice said. "Over there." Heavy footsteps approached her hiding place. Grace held her breath, pressing herself harder against the wall, but she knew it was futile. In moments, rough hands grabbed her arm, yanking her from her concealment. "Well, well, what do we have here?" The man's tobacco-stained smile made Grace's skin crawl. He was tall and wiry, with a pockmarked face and eyes cold as a snake's. "Boys, I found our little bookkeeper." The other 2 men approached, one short and stocky with a thick beard, the other tall with a jagged scar across his cheek. All 3 wore dusty trail clothes and gun belts that had seen heavy use. "Now, darlin'," the pockmarked man said, dragging her into the center of the barn. You're gonna tell us that combination, or things are gonna get mighty unpleasant." "I don't know it," Grace lied, her voice surprisingly steady despite her fear. "Mrs. Patterson never trusted me with it." The scarred man laughed. "That ain't what we heard in town. The old lady brags about her educated Eastern girl who handles all her business affairs." The three men spread out, forming a half-circle around Grace, backing her against a stall door. The horse inside nickered nervously, sensing the tension. "Last chance," the pockmarked man said, drawing a knife from his belt. "Numbers, now." Grace's mind raced. If she gave them the combination, they'd kill her. If she didn't, they'd torture her first, then kill her. Either way, Mrs. Patterson would lose everything she'd worked for her entire life. "The sheriff will be back from his rounds any minute," Grace said, grasping at anything that might buy her time. "He always checks on the ranch when Mrs. Patterson is away." The bearded man looked nervously at the leader. "Jed, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Jed snapped, the pockmarked leader tightening his grip on the knife. "She's lying. Even if she ain't, we'll be long gone before any law shows up." He took a step toward Grace, knife glinting in what little light remained in the barn. Grace backed away until she felt the rough wood of the stall door pressing against her spine. There was nowhere left to go. Her fingers clutched at empty air, searching for anything she might use to defend herself. Suddenly, the barn door swung open wider. All four people froze, turning toward the entrance. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, the brim of a cowboy hat shadowing his features. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. Then the newcomer stepped forward, the spurs on his boots jingling softly with each deliberate step. "Evening, gentlemen," a deep voice said, calm as still water but with an undercurrent of steel. "Seems to me you're bothering the lady." As he moved further into the barn, Grace could make out his features. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps no more than 30, with broad shoulders and a face weathered by sun and wind. His dark hair was visible beneath his hat, and his eyes, even in the dim light, were intensely focused on the three men threatening her. "This ain't your concern, mister," Jed said, turning his attention to the newcomer while keeping Grace cornered. "Just a little business discussion between us and the lady." The cowboy's hand rested casually near the holstered revolver at his hip. Three armed men cornering a woman alone in a barn after dark doesn't look much like business to me. Grace saw the bearded man's hand inch toward his gun. "Wade," she blurted out a warning, recognizing the cowboy now as Wade Porter, one of the hands who worked the north section of the ranch. She'd seen him occasionally when he came to collect supplies or deliver reports, but they'd rarely exchanged more than a few words. Wade's gaze flicked briefly to Grace, then back to the three men. His stance shifted slightly. "Ready." "You boys are standing on the wrong side of a line you don't want to cross," Wade said, his voice deceptively casual. "I suggest you back away from Miss Collins and head out while you still can." The scarred man spat on the ground. "3 against 1. I like those odds." Wade's mouth curved into the barest hint of a smile, but there was no humor in his eyes. "You're making a mistake there. It's not 3 against 1. It's 3 against me." The way he said it sent a chill down Grace's spine, not from fear but from the absolute certainty in his voice. Jed, clearly the leader, took a step forward, positioning himself between his men. "We're taking the safe combination from this woman, then we're taking the money. You can either walk away or die right here." Wade took another step forward, deliberately crossing an invisible line on the barn floor. "You'll regret crossing this line," he said quietly. "Last chance to ride out." The next few seconds seemed to stretch into eternity for Grace. She saw Jed's hand twitch, moving for his gun, saw Wade's lightning-fast response, heard the deafening blast of gunfire in the confined space of the barn. When the echo of shots died away, Jed was on the ground, clutching his shoulder and cursing. The bearded man stood frozen, his gun half drawn, while the scarred man had his hands raised slightly. Wade's revolver was leveled steadily, smoke still curling from the barrel. He hadn't even drawn it fully from the holster for the first shot. "Next one won't be in the shoulder," Wade said calmly. "Drop your weapons." The bearded man looked like he might still try something, but a groan from Jed seemed to change his mind. Both standing men slowly removed their gun belts and let them fall to the floor. "Now drag your friend out of here and don't come back," Wade continued. "Sheriff Tanner will be mighty interested to hear about 3 men trying to rob the Lazy P." "You've made a mistake," the scarred man growled as they helped Jed to his feet. "This ain't over." Wade's expression didn't change. "It is for tonight." Grace watched in disbelief as the 3 men retreated, practically dragging their wounded leader. When they had gone, Wade quickly moved to the barn door, watching until the sound of horses galloping away confirmed their departure. Only then did he turn his attention fully to Grace. "Are you hurt, Miss Collins?" The concern in his voice broke something inside her. The fear, the tension, the near certainty of death that had been coursing through her veins suddenly transformed into overwhelming relief. Her legs gave way and she sank to her knees on the dirt floor. I'm all right," she managed to say, though her voice shook. "They didn't. They just wanted." She couldn't seem to form a complete sentence. Wade crossed to her in 3 long strides, kneeling beside her. Up close, Grace could see his eyes were a deep blue, filled with concern. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw and lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned. "It's over now," he said gently. "You're safe, Miss Collins." "Grace," she said automatically. "Please call me Grace." It seemed absurd to insist on formality with a man who had just saved her life. A small smile touched his lips. "Grace, then." He offered his hand to help her up. "Let's get you inside. Those men might think better of running, and I'd rather not have a second confrontation in the open." His hand was warm and calloused, the hand of a man who worked hard for his living. Grace took it gratefully, allowing him to pull her to her feet. Her legs still felt unsteady, but she managed to stand. "How did you know?" she asked as they moved toward the barn door, Wade positioning himself protectively between her and the entrance. "How did you know I was in trouble?" Wade checked the yard carefully before guiding her out into the night. "I was heading back from the North Range. Saw 3 horses I didn't recognize tied up at the house, but no sign of visitors inside. Something didn't feel right." He glanced down at her. "When I heard them talking about a woman hiding in the barn, I knew it had to be you." They crossed the yard quickly, Wade's hand hovering near his revolver the entire time. The main house was dark and silent, but Wade insisted on checking each room before allowing Grace to light any lamps. "They're gone," he confirmed after securing the house. "But I'll stay here tonight just to be sure they don't circle back." Grace sank into a chair at the kitchen table, her hands still trembling slightly. "I don't know how to thank you." Wade set his hat on the table and ran a hand through his dark hair. "No need for thanks. Any decent man would have done the same." "But they didn't," Grace said softly. "You were the only one who came." Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding perhaps, or something deeper that neither was ready to acknowledge. Wade was the first to look away. "You should try to get some rest, Miss Grace. I'll keep watch." Grace knew she wouldn't sleep, not with the memory of those men still so fresh, not with the sound of gunfire still echoing in her ears, and not with Wade Porter sitting vigilant in Mrs. Patterson's kitchen, his presence both reassuring and somehow unsettling in ways she couldn't define. "I'll make coffee," she said instead, rising from her chair. "It seems we both have a long night ahead of us." Wade nodded, a hint of appreciation in his eyes. "That would be welcome." As Grace busied herself with the coffee pot, she felt something shift in the air between them. Whatever happened next, she knew nothing would be quite the same after tonight. The line Wade had spoken of had been crossed, not just by the thieves, but perhaps by fate itself. The coffee began to boil as the Montana night settled fully around the ranch house, wrapping them in darkness broken only by the warm glow of the kitchen lamp and the strange new light of possibility. Dawn broke over the eastern hills, painting the Montana sky in hues of pink and gold. Grace hadn't slept more than an hour, dozing fitfully in the parlor while Wade kept his vigilant watch from the kitchen. She stirred at the sound of movement, finding him standing at the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the early morning light. "They didn't come back," he said without turning, sensing her awakening. "But we should still be cautious. Men like that don't give up easily." Grace smoothed her rumpled dress, acutely aware of how disheveled she must look. "Do you think they'll return?" Wade turned from the window, his eyes shadowed from the long night. "Not right away. That one I shot will need tending, but they know about the money now, and men like that, they hold grudges." Rising from the sofa where she'd spent the uncomfortable night, Grace moved to stoke the dying embers in the fireplace. "Mrs. Patterson returns tomorrow. I should ride into town and send a telegram, warn her about what happened." "I'll escort you," Wade said immediately. "It's not safe for you to travel alone." Grace was about to protest that she'd been managing her own affairs since arriving in Montana, but the memory of those men's faces stopped her. "Thank you," she said instead. "I appreciate your concern." Wade nodded, then hesitated, looking almost uncomfortable. I should check on the horses, make sure everything's secure before we head out." He retrieved his hat from the table. "Would an hour be enough time for you to get ready?" "Yes, that's fine." Grace watched him move toward the door, his movements fluid despite the long night without sleep. "Mr. Porter," she called just as he reached for the doorknob. He paused, looking back at her with those intensely blue eyes. "Wade," he corrected gently. "Wade," she echoed, a small smile touching her lips. "I never properly thanked you for saving my life last night." Something flickered across his face, embarrassment perhaps, or something deeper. Anyone would have done the same. "But they didn't," Grace said, repeating her words from the night before. "You did." For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the room, the morning light streaming through the windows between them. Then Wade touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement and slipped outside, leaving Grace alone with thoughts that had nothing to do with the danger they still faced. An hour later, Grace had washed, changed into a fresh blue dress, and packed a small bag with essentials in case they couldn't return to the ranch immediately. She'd also retrieved Mrs. Patterson's ledger from the office, knowing she might need to account for any ranch business while in town. Wade was waiting by the corral with 2 saddled horses when she emerged from the house. He'd also changed his clothes, she noticed, and had a rifle in a scabbard attached to his saddle. "You ride?" he asked, a hint of surprise in his voice as she approached. Grace smiled, some of her confidence returning in the safety of daylight. "I wasn't always a bookkeeper, Mr. Porter. I grew up riding in Massachusetts, though admittedly those horses were rather more genteel than your Western stock." A ghost of a smile touched Wade's lips. "Well, lady here is about as gentle as they come," he said, patting the chestnut mare he'd saddled for her. "Mrs. Patterson keeps her for visitors who aren't used to spirited mounts." Grace approached the mare, offering her hand for the horse to sniff before stroking her velvety nose. She's lovely. She turned to Wade. And what's your horse's name? Diablo, Wade said, a hint of affection in his voice as he glanced at the large black gelding. Though he's not nearly as devilish as his name suggests, just likes people to think he is. Rather like his rider, perhaps. Grace suggested before she could stop herself. Wade looked at her sharply, then his expression softened into a genuine smile that transformed his face entirely. Perhaps, he conceded, offering his hands to help her mount. Grace placed her foot in his interlaced fingers, feeling his strength as he boosted her easily into the saddle. Their eyes met briefly as she settled herself, and that strange current she'd felt the night before passed between them again. Town's about an hour's ride, Wade said, mounting Diablo with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback. Stay close to me and keep your eyes open. I don't expect trouble, but it pays to be cautious. They rode out from the ranch as the sun climbed higher in the sky, Wade setting a comfortable pace that allowed them to talk. The landscape opened before them, rolling hills covered in late summer grasses turned golden in the sun, the distant mountains rising blue and majestic on the horizon. "How long have you worked for Mrs. Patterson?" Grace asked as they rode side by side down the rutted road that led toward the town of Silver Creek. "Going on 5 years now," Wade replied. "Started as just another hand, worked my way up to foreman of the north section last year. And before that..." Wade's expression grew more guarded. "Moved around, Texas mostly, sometime in Kansas, Colorado." There was something in his tone that suggested more to the story, but Grace didn't press. Everyone in the West seemed to have parts of their past they preferred not to discuss. She certainly did. "What about you?" Wade asked after a moment. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned you came from back east, Boston, wasn't it?" Grace nodded. "My father was an accountant there. He taught me the trade from the time I was old enough to add numbers." She smiled at the memory. "He always said, numbers don't care if you're a man or a woman, Grace. They only care if you're right or wrong." Wise man. "He was," Grace agreed, feeling the familiar pang of loss. "When he died last year, I found I couldn't stay in Boston. Too many memories, and too few opportunities for a woman alone. When I saw Mrs. Patterson's advertisement seeking someone with accounting experience, well, it seemed like an adventure." "And has it been?" "An adventure," Grace laughed softly. "More so than I anticipated, especially after last night." Wade's expression grew serious again. "Those men, did they say anything that might help identify them? Any names?" "The leader was called Jed," Grace recalled. "The others never used names, I heard. They knew about the cattle sale money, knew I was the bookkeeper." She frowned. "They must have been watching the ranch, gathering information. Or someone told them," Wade said grimly. "Information like that doesn't just float around. Someone specific to target specific knowledge about the safe. That sounds like inside information." The implication was clear, and it unsettled Grace deeply. "You think someone at the ranch is involved?" Wade shrugged. "It's possible. Or someone in town who knows the ranch business. Either way, we need to be careful who we trust." They rode in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The road wound through a stand of pines, offering welcome shade from the increasingly warm day. Birds called from the branches above, and a rabbit darted across their path, startling Lady momentarily before she settled again. "You handle her well," Wade observed, watching Grace calm the mare with a gentle hand on her neck. "My father believed every well-bred young woman should ride," Grace said. "Though I suspect his definition of riding was somewhat different from what constitutes riding out here." "How so?" "Well, for one thing, I was expected to use a side saddle," Grace said with a smile. and my riding habit had considerably more fabric than these practical clothes I've adopted since coming west. Wade's eyes traveled briefly over her form in the saddle, then quickly away, a hint of color touching his tanned cheeks. I imagine you were quite the proper Boston lady. I try to be, Grace admitted, though my father often despaired of my unconventional interests. He indulged my love of mathematics and accounting because I showed aptitude, but he always hoped I would marry well and become a society wife. And you didn't want that? Grace considered the question. I wanted more, she said finally, though I wasn't entirely sure what more looked like until I came west. And now, Wade asked, his voice quiet, have you found what you were looking for? Before Grace could answer, Wade suddenly tensed, his hand moving to the rifle in its scabbard. Riders coming, he said, nodding toward a cloud of dust visible on the road ahead. Grace felt her heart rate quicken. Do you think? Get off the road, Wade instructed, already guiding Diablo toward the trees that lined their path. Quickly. Grace followed, urging Lady into the cover of the pines. They pulled up in the shadows, watching the road. Wade had drawn his rifle, holding it ready across his lap. Could just be travelers, he said, though his posture remained alert. But better safe than sorry. The riders came into view, 4 men on horseback, moving at an easy trot. Not the men from the night before, Grace realized with relief, but strangers nonetheless. They passed without slowing, apparently unaware of the 2 people watching from the trees. Ranch hands from the Double J, looks like, Wade said, relaxing slightly as he recognized the brand on one of the horses. Still, we should be careful. Word travels fast in these parts. They waited until the riders were well past before rejoining the road, Wade insisting they maintain a more watchful pace for the remainder of the journey. The encounter had reminded them both of the danger still lurking. When they crested the final hill, the town of Silver Creek came into view in the valley below. It wasn't much compared to Boston, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple rising above the rest, thin columns of smoke from stoves and fireplaces rising into the clear blue sky. But to Grace, in that moment, it represented safety. We'll go to the sheriff's office first, Wade decided as they approached the outskirts of town. Then the telegraph office. You can send your message to Mrs. Patterson while I arrange for some of the boys to ride out and secure the ranch. Grace nodded, grateful for his decisive action. As they rode down the main street, several people nodded in greeting to Wade, eyeing Grace with the usual curiosity that small towns reserved for newcomers, though she'd been to Silver Creek often enough on ranch business. They tied their horses outside the sheriff's office, a small building with a weathered sign and a bench out front where an elderly man sat whittling a piece of wood. "Morning, Pete," Wade greeted him. "Sheriff Tanner inside," the old man nodded. "Yep, got himself a prisoner from last night." Drunk Cowboy started a fight at Clara's place. Wade's hand came to rest lightly on Grace's back as he guided her inside, the gesture protective rather than presumptuous. Sheriff Tanner looked up from his desk as they entered, his weathered face breaking into a smile of recognition. "Wade Porter," he said, standing to shake Wade's hand. "And Miss Collins from the Lazy P. What brings you both to town on such a fine morning?" "Trouble, I'm afraid," Wade said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. 3 men tried to rob the ranch last night. They were after the cattle money in Mrs. Patterson's safe. The sheriff's smile vanished. "Anyone hurt?" "I winged one of them," Wade said, "but they got away." Grace stepped forward. "They knew about the safe, Sheriff. They knew I was the bookkeeper. They were waiting for a time when Mrs. Patterson was away and the ranch was lightly staffed." Tanner gestured for them to sit as he took out a notebook. "Tell me everything. What they looked like, What they said, any names you might have heard. For the next half hour, Grace and Wade recounted the events of the previous night in detail. The sheriff took careful notes, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Sounds like the Blackwell gang," he said when they had finished. "They've been working their way through this part of Montana for the past few months. Hit the Rocking W Ranch over in Garrison County last month. Got away with nearly $2,000. Why haven't they been caught?" Grace asked. Sheriff Tanner sighed. "Territory's big, Miss Collins. Laws spread thin. They move across county lines, always staying one step ahead." He looked at Wade. "You say you shot the leader in the shoulder?" Wade nodded. "Left shoulder. Clean through, I think. That'll help identify them." The sheriff stood. "I'll send telegrams to the surrounding counties, alert them to be on the lookout. And I'll ride out to the ranch this afternoon with a deputy, make sure everything's secure." "I'd appreciate that," Wade said, rising as well. "I've got to get Miss Collins back safely, then gather some of the hands to bring in from the range. We've been too spread out, leaves the main house vulnerable." As they stepped back onto the boardwalk, the morning sun now high overhead, Grace found herself unexpectedly moved by Wade's concern for her safety and for the ranch. There was something reassuring about his quiet competence, his unassuming protection. "Telegraph office next," she suggested. Wade nodded, offering his arm almost unconsciously as they stepped down into the dusty street. Grace took it, feeling the solid strength of him beside her, a stark contrast to the uncertainty that had plagued her since the attack. At the telegraph office, Grace carefully composed a message to Mrs. Patterson, explaining what had happened without causing undue alarm, assuring her that the ranch was secure and the money safe. Wade, meanwhile, sent messages to the various sections of the ranch, calling in trusted hands to bolster security. When they emerged, the day had grown hot, the sun beating down on the wooden buildings and dusty street. "We should get something to eat before heading back," Wade suggested, nodding toward the small cafe across the street. "It'll be mid-afternoon by the time we reach the ranch." The cafe was cool and relatively quiet, the lunch rush not yet begun. They found a table near the back, and Wade insisted on positioning himself with a view of the door, a habit Grace suspected came from years of caution. "You've been very kind," Grace said after they'd ordered coffee and stew from the matronly woman who ran the cafe. "Taking care of all this, protecting me. I'm in your debt." Wade shook his head. "No debt." "It's what any. If you say it's what anyone would have done one more time, Mr. Porter, I may be forced to throw this spoon at you," Grace interrupted with a small smile. "We both know that's not true. You risked your life for me last night." Wade looked down at the table, a hint of that earlier discomfort returning. "I've known men who wouldn't hesitate to stand up against 3 armed outlaws, and I've known men who would ride the other way rather than get involved. I'm just glad I was there." "So am I," Grace said softly. Their eyes met across the table, and something in Wade's gaze made Grace's breath catch. There was warmth there, and concern, but also something more, a spark of interest that went beyond mere duty or chivalry. The moment was broken when the cafe owner arrived with their food. As they ate, their conversation turned to safer topics: ranch business, the coming autumn, life in Silver Creek. Wade, Grace discovered, was a surprisingly good conversationalist once he moved past his initial reserve. "You mentioned you were from Texas originally," Grace said as they finished their meal. "What brought you to Montana?" A shadow crossed Wade's face. "Change of scenery," he said after a pause that went on just a beat too long. "Texas was complicated. Montana offered a fresh start." There was clearly more to the story, but Grace didn't press. Everyone had the right to their secrets, especially in a place like the West where so many came seeking new beginnings. They were just preparing to leave when the cafe door opened, and 3 men entered. Grace felt Wade tense beside her, his hand moving instinctively toward his holster, but these weren't the men from the night before. Wade Porter, one of them called, a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache. "Thought that was your horse outside. You remember me? Jack Wilson. We rode together on that cattle drive to Cheyenne 2 years back." Wade relaxed slightly, rising to shake the man's hand. "Jack, good to see you. You working around these parts now? Signed on with the Flying W last month," Jack confirmed, then noticed Grace. He removed his hat. "Madam." "Miss Grace Collins," Wade introduced her. "Bookkeeper for the Lazy P. Miss Collins, this is Jack Wilson, one of the best hands I've ever worked with." Grace smiled, acknowledging the introduction, but she couldn't help noticing how Wade had subtly positioned himself between her and the newcomers, still protective, even with men he knew. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, Wade made their excuses, citing the need to return to the ranch before dark. Outside, he helped Grace mount Lady, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary at her waist. "Friends of yours?" Grace asked as they rode out of town, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the western mountains. "Acquaintances," Wade corrected. "Good cowboys. Honest men as far as I know." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the landscape opening around them once more. Grace found herself studying Wade's profile against the backdrop of the Montana sky, the straight line of his nose, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for any sign of danger. "Tell me something," she said eventually, "when you came into the barn last night." "Were you afraid?" Wade considered the question. "Not of them," he said finally, "but afraid for you." "Yes." The simple honesty of his answer touched her. "I was terrified," she admitted, "not just of dying, but of—" She trailed off, unable to voice the other fears that had gripped her when those men had cornered her. Wade's expression darkened. "You don't need to say it. I understand." And she believed he did. There was something in his eyes, a knowledge of the darker side of humanity that spoke of experience beyond his years. They were about halfway back to the ranch when Wade suddenly pulled Diablo to a halt, his posture alert. Grace stopped beside him, instantly concerned. "What is it?" "Not sure," he said quietly, eyes scanning the tree line ahead. "Something doesn't feel right." Grace followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual in the peaceful landscape. Still, she'd learned to trust Wade's instincts. They waited, the only sound the soft breathing of their horses and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Then Wade relaxed slightly. "Probably nothing. Let's keep moving but stay close." They continued more cautiously, Wade leading them slightly off the main trail, using the trees for cover where possible. Grace found herself jumping at every snapped twig and rustle of leaves, the peaceful ride of the morning replaced by tense vigilance. When they finally caught sight of the ranch buildings in the distance, Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Wade, too, seemed to relax marginally. "Almost home," he said, offering her a reassuring smile. "Home." The word struck Grace unexpectedly. In the 8 months she'd lived at the Lazy P, she'd thought of it as her residence, her place of employment, but not truly home. Yet somehow, riding beside Wade, returning to the safety of the ranch after their ordeal, the word felt right. As they approached the main house, they were met by 2 ranch hands riding out to greet them, Cole and Everett, both men Grace recognized from her work managing the payroll. "Mr. Porter," Cole called, touching the brim of his hat. "Sheriff Tanner's already here with his deputy. Been waiting on you folks for near an hour." "Any trouble?" Wade asked as they all rode toward the house. "Nope. All quiet. Some of the boys from the East Range came in too, like you asked in your telegram. Wade nodded, satisfied. Good. Let's not take any chances until Mrs. Patterson returns. At the house, Sheriff Tanner and his deputy were waiting on the porch. Grace let Wade handle the discussion of security arrangements while she went inside to freshen up, the long day in the saddle having left her dusty and tired. When she emerged from her room 20 minutes later, having changed into a fresh dress and pinned her hair back neatly, she found Wade and the sheriff still deep in conversation in the parlor. "Miss Collins," Tanner said, rising as she entered. "I was just telling Wade here that we've sent word to all the surrounding counties. If the Blackwell gang tries to sell horses or spend any significant amount of money within 100 miles, we'll hear about it." "Thank you, Sheriff," Grace said, taking a seat. "I appreciate your thoroughness." Wade's arranged for round-the-clock guards on the house and barn until Mrs. Patterson returns, the sheriff continued. "I'd feel better if you weren't staying here alone tonight, though." "I won't be," Grace said. "Mrs. Henderson from the cookhouse has already offered to stay with me." Wade nodded approval. "Mrs. Henderson's husband will be on guard duty as well. The house will be secure." After finalizing the security arrangements, the sheriff and his deputy departed, promising to return the next day when Mrs. Patterson was due to arrive. Wade lingered, seemingly reluctant to leave despite the late hour. "You should get some rest," Grace told him as they stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and reds. "You've been awake for nearly 2 days." "I'll sleep when I know you're safe," Wade said, his gaze moving from the sunset to her face. In the golden light, his blue eyes seemed to hold depths she hadn't noticed before. "Grace," whatever he had been about to say was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Henderson from the cookhouse, a formidable woman in her 50s carrying a small bundle of her belongings for the night. "Evening, Miss Collins, Mr. Porter," she said cheerfully. "I've brought some fresh bread and stew for supper. Figured you both could use a good meal after all the excitement." Wade stepped back, the moment broken. "That's mighty kind of you, Mrs. Henderson. I should go check on the guard positions before it gets dark." Grace watched him stride away, feeling an odd mixture of disappointment and something else she wasn't quite ready to name. Whatever had been building between them throughout the day, that current of awareness, of connection, remained unresolved, suspended in the space between duty and possibility. That night, despite the comfort of Mrs. Henderson's presence and the knowledge that armed men patrolled the property, Grace slept fitfully. Her dreams were a confusing blend of terror and rescue, of running through endless barns with faceless men in pursuit, and of Wade appearing just when all hope seemed lost. She woke early, the pale light of dawn barely filtering through her curtains. Dressing quickly in a practical skirt and blouse, she made her way to the kitchen, finding Mrs. Henderson already preparing breakfast. "Morning, Miss Collins," the older woman greeted her. "Coffee's hot if you want some." "Thank you," Grace said, gratefully accepting a cup. "Any sign of Wade?" "Mr. Porter this morning." Mrs. Henderson gave her a knowing look that made Grace blush slightly. "He's been up since before dawn, checking the property with the boys. Should be back for breakfast soon enough." Sure enough, the kitchen door opened a few minutes later and Wade entered, looking tired but alert. He'd changed his clothes again, Grace noticed, and had clearly taken time to shave despite the early hour. "Morning," he said, his eyes finding Grace immediately. "Everything's quiet." "No sign of trouble." "Mrs. Patterson's stage should arrive around noon," Grace reminded him, pouring a cup of coffee and offering it to him. Their fingers brushed as he took it, sending that now familiar current through her. "Once she's safely back, things can return to normal." Wade took a sip of his coffee, watching her over the rim of the cup. Normal, he repeated, as if testing the word. I'm not sure things will ever be quite the same as before. Before Grace could ask what he meant, the door opened again as several ranch hands came in for breakfast, filling the kitchen with noise and movement. The moment for private conversation was lost as Mrs. Henderson began serving plates of eggs and bacon. The morning passed quickly, with Grace catching only glimpses of Wade as he continued to oversee security around the ranch. She busied herself with bringing Mrs. Patterson's ledgers up to date, preparing to brief her employer on all that had transpired during her absence. Just before noon, a rider approached from town the sheriff's deputy, coming to escort Mrs. Patterson from the stage station to the ranch. Wade organized a small welcome party, positioning men strategically along the road to ensure safe passage. "You've thought of everything," Grace commented as she stood beside him near the main gate, watching the horizon for signs of the approaching carriage. Wade shrugged. "Just being careful. Those men are still out there somewhere. Do you think they'll try again?" Grace asked, voicing the fear that had lingered at the back of her mind. "Not right away," Wade said. "Not with all these men around and the sheriff aware of their presence, but eventually, possibly." Grace shivered despite the warm day. "I've been thinking about what you said about someone providing them information. If that's true, they might just wait until things calm down." Wade nodded grimly. "Which is why we need to find them before they find us again." Before Grace could respond, a cloud of dust appeared on the road from town. Minutes later, a carriage came into view, flanked by riders, the sheriff's deputy, and two of the ranch hands who had gone to meet them. Mrs. Patterson was a small, wiry woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and the energy of someone half her age. She descended from the carriage with assistance from the deputy, her sharp eyes immediately finding Grace and Wade waiting to greet her. "Miss Collins, Mr. Porter," she called as she approached. "Sheriff Tanner sent a telegram to Helena. Said there was some trouble with Thieves. Everyone all right?" "We're fine, Mrs. Patterson," Grace assured her, taking the older woman's arm as they walked toward the house. "Thanks to Mr. Porter's intervention." Wade followed a few paces behind, allowing Grace to fill Mrs. Patterson in on the events of the past 2 days. By the time they reached the house, the older woman's expression had grown serious. "Sounds like you handled things admirably, both of you," she said, settling into her favorite chair in the parlor. "Wade, I want extra men on patrol for at least a week. And Grace, we should move that money to the bank in town as soon as possible." "Already arranged," Wade assured her. "Sheriff Tanner will provide an escort tomorrow morning." Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. "Good. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to rest after that dreadful stage journey. We'll talk more at supper." With Mrs. Patterson safely returned and resting, the tension that had gripped the ranch began to ease slightly. The extra hands returned to their regular duties, though Wade maintained a rotation of guards around the main buildings. Grace found him in the barn late that afternoon, checking on the horses. He looked up as she entered, a smile warming his features. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Yes," Grace said, moving closer. "Mrs. Patterson is napping and the house is secure. She hesitated, suddenly unsure of her purpose in seeking him out. "I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done." Wade set down the brush he'd been using on Diablo, turning to face her fully. "You've thanked me enough, Grace." "Have I?" She took another step closer. "I'm not sure that's possible." The space between them seemed charged with unspoken words, with possibilities neither had voiced. Wade's eyes held hers, searching, questioning. "When I saw those men threatening you," he said quietly, "something happened to me, something I can't quite explain." Grace's heart quickened. "What do you mean?" Wade struggled visibly with his words, a man more accustomed to action than to expressing such sentiments. "I mean, the thought of them hurting you made me." He shook his head. "I've never felt that kind of fear and fury mixed together, not for someone I barely knew." "And now," Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "now that you know me better," Wade took a step toward her, closing the distance between them. "Now I'm even more confused," he admitted. "Because these feelings, they're not going away, they're getting stronger." Grace felt her breath catch. "Wade," the barn door opened, flooding the dim interior with late afternoon sunlight. One of the ranch hands stood there, looking slightly embarrassed at interrupting what was clearly a private moment. "Sorry, Mr. Porter, but Sheriff Tanner's back. Says he has news about those outlaws." Wade's expression shifted instantly from vulnerable to alert. "I'll be right there." He turned back to Grace, regret evident in his eyes. "We should go hear what he has to say." Grace nodded, the moment once again slipping away from them. They walked together to the house, not touching but acutely aware of each other's presence. Sheriff Tanner was waiting in Mrs. Patterson's study, his expression grim. Mrs. Patterson herself was already there, looking troubled. "Wade, Miss Collins," the sheriff greeted them. "Got some news you both need to hear. One of my deputies found a campsite about 10 miles east of here, near the old Wilson place. Blood on the ground, bandages, signs of 3 men. They're holed up there or were until recently." "The Blackwell gang?" Wade asked. "Almost certainly. And there's more. A drifter came into town this afternoon, stopped at the saloon. Said he encountered 3 men on the trail yesterday, one with a wounded shoulder. They were asking questions about the Lazy P, specifically about guard rotations and how many men were stationed at the main house." Grace felt a chill run through her. "They're planning another attempt." "Seems that way," the sheriff agreed. "But now we know where to find them. I'm organizing a posse to ride out at first light tomorrow. Wade, I'd like you to join us." "Of course," Wade said without hesitation. "Mrs. Patterson frowned. "Is that wise, Sheriff? These men know Wade's face, they'll be expecting him." "Which is why I want him with us," Tanner replied. "These men are dangerous, I need experienced guns." The conversation continued, with plans being made for the morning's expedition. Grace listened, a growing sense of dread building in her stomach at the thought of Wade riding out to confront the very men who had nearly killed them both. When the sheriff finally departed, Mrs. Patterson excused herself for dinner preparations, leaving Grace and Wade alone in the study. "I don't like this," Grace said as soon as the door closed behind Mrs. Patterson. "It feels like a trap." Wade moved to her side. "The sheriff knows what he's doing, Grace, and so do I. These men need to be brought to justice before they hurt someone else. And if they hurt you instead—" The words escaped before she could stop them, revealing more of her feelings than she'd intended. Wade's expression softened. "Is that concern I hear, Miss Collins?" he asked, a gentle teasing in his voice despite the seriousness of the situation. "Yes," Grace admitted, abandoning pretense. "Yes, it is concern. I nearly lost you once already, Wade Porter. I'm not eager to repeat the experience." Wade's hand came up to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch feather light. "You won't lose me," he promised. "I have far too much to come back for." Their eyes met, and in that moment, all the unspoken words between them seemed to hang in the air, fragile, precious, and full of promise. Wade's gaze dropped to her lips, and Grace felt herself leaning toward him almost involuntarily. A knock at the door startled them apart. "Dinner's ready, Mrs. Henderson called through the closed door. Wade stepped back, his eyes still holding Grace's. "We'll finish this conversation," he said softly. "After tomorrow. After this is over." Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As they moved toward the dining room, she felt both fear and hope battling within her: fear for the danger Wade would face the next day, and hope for what might await them when he returned. Dinner was a subdued affair, with Mrs. Patterson doing most of the talking as she shared news from her daughter in Helena. Grace found it difficult to focus, her thoughts constantly returning to the posse that would ride out the next morning and the confrontation that awaited them. After the meal, Wade excused himself to meet with the men who would remain behind to guard the ranch. Mrs. Patterson beckoned Grace to join her in the parlor, settling into her rocking chair with a knowing look. "So," the older woman said once they were alone, "are you going to tell me what's going on between you and my foreman?" Grace felt her cheeks warm. I'm not sure what you mean, Mrs. Patterson." The older woman snorted softly. "My dear, I may be old, but I'm not blind. The way you two look at each other reminds me of how my Henry and I were back when we were young and building this ranch together." Grace looked down at her hands, unable to deny the observation but unsure how to respond. Mrs. Patterson had always been kind to her, more like a mother figure than an employer, but this was territory Grace hadn't expected to navigate. "He's a good man," Mrs. Patterson continued when Grace remained silent. "One of the best I've ever hired. Honest, hardworking, loyal to a fault." "Yes," Grace agreed softly, "he is all of those things." Mrs. Patterson studied her for a long moment. "He also has ghosts, that one. Came here carrying shadows I've never asked about." Her voice softened. "But I've seen those shadows lifting these past few days, ever since that night in the barn." Grace looked up, meeting the older woman's knowing gaze. "I care for him," she admitted finally. "More than I expected to. More than is perhaps wise, given how little time we've known each other." "Wisdom and love rarely keep the same company, my dear," Mrs. Patterson said with a gentle smile. "Sometimes the heart knows in days what the mind would take years to accept." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the ticking of the mantel clock and the crackling of the fire, the only sounds in the cozy room. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, with stars beginning to appear in the clear Montana sky. "What if he doesn't come back?" Grace asked finally, voicing her deepest fear. Mrs. Patterson reached across to pat her hand. "He'll come back," she said with quiet certainty. "Men like Wade Porter don't leave unfinished business behind, especially not the kind that matters most." Later that night, unable to sleep, Grace stood at her bedroom window looking out at the darkened ranch. Lanterns marked the positions of the guards Wade had posted, moving occasionally as the men made their rounds. Somewhere out there, she knew, Wade was making final preparations for the morning, perhaps unable to rest just as she was. A movement near the barn caught her eye, a tall figure emerging into the moonlight. Even at this distance, she recognized Wade's distinctive walk, the set of his shoulders. He stood for a moment looking up at the main house, and Grace had the uncanny feeling he was looking directly at her window, though she knew he couldn't possibly see her in the darkness. Acting on impulse, she grabbed her shawl and slipped quietly from her room, making her way down the back stairs and out the kitchen door. The night air was cool, autumn making its presence felt in the chill that settled after sundown. Wade was still near the barn when she approached, his back to her as he gazed up at the star-filled sky. "Couldn't sleep?" Grace asked softly. He turned, not seeming surprised to find her there. "Too much on my mind," he admitted. "You should be resting." "So should you." She moved to stand beside him, following his gaze upward. "The stars are beautiful tonight." "They are," Wade agreed, though when she glanced at him, she found he was looking at her, not the sky. "Grace, about tomorrow." "Don't," she interrupted. "Don't make promises you might not be able to keep." Wade's expression grew serious. I was going to say that no matter what happens tomorrow, these past few days have been important to me. You've been important to me. Grace felt emotion welling in her throat. And you to me, she whispered. They stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool night, could see the way the moonlight silvered the edges of his dark hair and cast shadows across the planes of his face. For a moment, they simply existed together in the quiet night, with only the distant sounds of the ranch around them. When this is over, Wade said finally, when those men are brought to justice and the ranch is safe again, would you consider taking a ride with me? There's a place up in the North Range I'd like to show you, a waterfall not many people know about. The simplicity of the invitation, the normalcy of it after all they'd been through made Grace smile. I'd like that very much. Wade's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers warm and calloused as they closed around her smaller ones. It was a tentative gesture, as if he was still unsure of his welcome despite everything that had passed between them. Grace tightened her grip, offering reassurance. Be careful tomorrow, she said. Come back to me. Wade's other hand came up to touch her cheek gently. I will, he promised, and this time there was no interruption as he leaned down to press his lips to hers in a kiss that held both tenderness and promise. When they parted, Grace saw in his eyes all the things they hadn't yet said to each other, the feelings that had grown so rapidly in the crucible of danger and shared experience. There would be time for words later, she told herself. After tomorrow, after he returned. You should go back inside, Wade said reluctantly. It's getting colder. Grace nodded, though she made no move to leave. What time will you ride out, First Light? The sheriff wants to catch them unawares, hopefully while they're still sleeping. I'll see you off, she decided. Don't try to stop me. A smile touched Wade's lips. I wouldn't dream of it, Miss Collins. I've already learned how stubborn you can be. They walked back to the house together, their hands still linked, reluctant to part. At the kitchen door, Wade kissed her once more, briefly but with feeling before stepping back. Sleep well, Grace, he said softly. Tomorrow will come soon enough. Dawn broke cold and misty the next morning, the sun not yet risen above the eastern mountains when Grace made her way to the main yard. The posse was gathering Sheriff Tanner, his deputy, 4 townsmen she recognized from Silver Creek, and 3 of the Lazy P hands. Wade was checking Diablo's saddle when she approached. He looked up, his expression softening when he saw her. He wore his trail clothes with a heavy coat against the morning chill, his revolver at his hip and a rifle in its saddle scabbard. You came, he said simply. I said I would. Grace held out a small package wrapped in a clean handkerchief. Mrs. Henderson sent breakfast, said you'd need your strength. Wade took it with a grateful smile. Tell her thank you. The sheriff called for the men to mount up, and Wade turned to Diablo, securing the breakfast package in his saddlebag. Grace stood back, watching as he swung easily into the saddle, settling his hat more firmly on his head. Be safe, she said, looking up at him. Wade's eyes held hers. I'll be back before you know it, he promised. Keep that waterfall in mind. Grace nodded, trying to smile despite the knot of worry in her stomach. I will. With a touch to the brim of his hat, Wade turned Diablo and rode to join the posse. Grace stood watching as they filed out of the ranch yard, following the sheriff eastward toward the old Wilson place. She remained there long after they had disappeared from sight, the sun finally cresting the mountains to cast long shadows across the empty yard. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Grace tried to occupy herself with work, updating ledgers and checking supply inventories, but her mind constantly returned to the posse and what they might be facing. Mrs. Patterson seemed to understand, assigning her simple tasks that wouldn't suffer from her distraction. By mid-afternoon, With no word from the sheriff or his men, the ranch had fallen into an uneasy waiting pattern. Even the usual sounds of activity seemed muted, as if the entire place was holding its breath. Grace was in the kitchen helping Mrs. Henderson prepare vegetables for supper when they heard the sound of horses approaching at speed. Both women rushed to the window, peering out to see riders coming fast down the main road to the ranch. "Is it them?" Mrs. Henderson asked, squinting against the late afternoon sun. "I can't make out who it is." Grace's heart raced as she strained to identify the riders. "I think. Yes, it's the sheriff's deputy in the lead and behind him." She pressed a hand to her mouth. "Someone's wounded. They're supporting him in the saddle." Without waiting to hear more, Grace ran for the front door, ignoring Mrs. Henderson's call to wait. She burst onto the porch just as the riders entered the yard, her eyes frantically searching for Wade among them. The deputy dismounted quickly, turning to help the injured rider. Relief flooded through Grace as she recognized not Wade but one of the townsmen, his arm bandaged and his face pale but conscious. "Miss Collins," the deputy called, seeing her on the porch. "We need a place to tend to Jim here. Took a bullet in the arm." "Of course," Grace said, already moving to help. "Bring him inside. Where are the others? Where's Wade?" The deputy's expression was grim as they helped the wounded man toward the house. "Still out there. The sheriff sent us back with Jim while they continued the pursuit. The outlaws split up when we found their camp. Sheriff Tanner, Wade, and the others went after the leader, the one Wade wounded before." Grace's momentary relief vanished. "How long ago?" "Couple hours. Sheriff said they'd follow as long as the trail was fresh. Could be nightfall before they return." Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway, her face concerned but composed. "Bring him into the parlor. Mrs. Henderson, fetch my medical kit from the study." As they settled the wounded man on the sofa, Grace moved to the window, staring out at the road as if she could make the rest of the posse appear through sheer force of will. The sky was beginning to darken with evening, and with gathering storm clouds a sudden change in the weather that boded ill for men tracking outlaws in unfamiliar territory. "They'll be all right," Mrs. Patterson said quietly, coming to stand beside her after tending to the wounded man. "Wade knows this country better than most. He won't lead them astray." Grace nodded, wanting to believe her. "The weather's turning," she said, watching as the first fat raindrops began to spatter against the window. "If they don't return soon." Mrs. Patterson squeezed her arm gently. "Have faith, my dear. In the meantime, we have work to do." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as the rain intensified outside. Grace helped tend to the wounded townsman, prepare a hot meal for when the others returned, and keep watch at the windows despite the limited visibility in the storm. The deputy organized the remaining ranch hands into patrols, concerned that the outlaws might circle back to the ranch while the posse was diverted. Night had fallen completely, the rain drumming steadily on the roof, when Grace heard the unmistakable sound of horses approaching through the downpour. She rushed to the front door, heedless of the rain as she stepped onto the porch, straining to see through the darkness. Lanterns appeared first, bobbing points of light in the gloom, followed by the shapes of riders, their slickers glistening with rain. Grace counted anxiously 4, 5, 6. All accounted for except the wounded man already inside. Sheriff Tanner was in the lead, his face grim beneath his dripping hat. Behind him came the other townsmen and ranch hands, all looking exhausted and soaked to the skin. And at the rear, leading not only Diablo but a second horse with a slumped figure tied to the saddle, rode Wade. Grace's heart leapt at the sight of him, apparently unharmed. She rushed down the porch steps into the rain, heedless of the water soaking her dress, reaching Wade just as he dismounted. "You're back," she said, the simple words carrying the weight of all her fear and relief. Wade's face, tired and rain-streaked, broke into a smile at the sight of her. "I told you I would be," he said, his voice hoarse from the long day. Only then did Grace look more closely at the figure on the second horse, a man with his hands bound behind him, his left shoulder heavily bandaged, his face a mask of sullen defeat. Jed, the leader of the outlaws who had cornered her in the barn just 3 days ago, though it felt like a lifetime had passed since then. "You caught him," she breathed. "Got all 3 of them," Sheriff Tanner confirmed, approaching through the rain. "The other 2 are already in my jail in town. This one gave us the most trouble, but Wade here tracked him for miles, even after the rain started washing away the trail." Wade shrugged off the praise. "Let's get inside before we all catch our death. Been a long enough day without adding pneumonia to it." The next hour was a flurry of activity as the returned men dried off, ate the hot food Mrs. Henderson had prepared, and recounted the day's events. The outlaw leader was secured in a storeroom under guard until he could be transported to town in the morning. Jim, the wounded townsman, was resting comfortably, his arm properly bandaged by Mrs. Patterson. Grace moved among them, serving coffee and food, but her eyes kept returning to Wade. He sat somewhat apart from the others, exhaustion evident in every line of his body as he methodically ate his stew. When their eyes met across the room, something passed between them: relief, yes, but also anticipation of the conversation they had promised each other. It was late when the kitchen finally emptied, most of the men finding places to sleep around the ranch rather than riding back to town in the continuing downpour. Grace was wiping down the large table when Wade appeared in the doorway, his hair still damp from washing up, but his clothes dry, borrowed from one of the other hands, she guessed, as they were slightly too small for his frame. "You should be resting," she said, though she made no move to send him away. "You've had a long day." Wade stepped into the kitchen, closing the door softly behind him. "I needed to see you first," he said, "properly, without an audience." Grace set down her cloth, turning to face him fully. "I was so worried," she admitted, "when I saw the riders returning and couldn't see you at first." In 3 strides, Wade crossed the room to her, his arms encircling her waist and drawing her against him. Grace went willingly, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the solid beat of his heart beneath her palm. "I'm here," he said softly. "Safe, and those men will never threaten you again." Grace looked up at him, taking in the weariness around his eyes, the day's growth of beard on his jaw, the intensity of his gaze as he looked down at her. "My hero," she said, only half teasing. Wade shook his head. "Not a hero, Grace. Just a man who couldn't bear the thought of you coming to harm." "And why is that, Mr. Porter?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why should my safety matter so much to a man who barely knew me a week ago?" Wade's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. "Because in the space of 3 days, you've become the most important person in my world," he said simply. "Because when I think of my future now, I can't imagine it without you in it." The words, so plainly spoken yet so profound, brought tears to Grace's eyes. "Wade." "I know it's fast," he continued, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped to trail down her cheek. "I know we have so much still to learn about each other, but I also know that when I saw you cornered in that barn, something changed in me, something fundamental. And every moment since then has only confirmed what I think I knew even then." "And what is that?" Grace asked, though she hoped she knew the answer. Wade's eyes, those intense blue eyes that had first caught her attention in the darkened barn, held hers without wavering. "That I love you, Grace Collins. Against all reason and common sense, I have fallen completely in love with you." The words, spoken aloud at last, seemed to fill the small kitchen, to wrap around them both in the quiet of the late evening. Outside, the rain continued to fall, cocooning them in their private world. "I love you too," Grace whispered, the truth of it resonating through her entire being. "I think perhaps I began to love you the moment you crossed that line in the barn, knowing full well what you were risking for a woman you barely knew." Wade's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. He lowered his head slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. But Grace rose on her tiptoes to meet him, their lips coming together in a kiss that held all the emotion, all the fear and relief and joy of the past 3 days. When they finally parted, Wade rested his forehead against hers, his arms still encircling her waist. "So about that waterfall," he murmured. Grace laughed softly, the sound warming the space between them. "Is that a proper outing for a respectable bookkeeper and a ranch foreman?" "Probably not," Wade admitted with a grin. "We might need a chaperone." "Or," Grace suggested, her eyes twinkling, "we might need something more official than just an outing." Wade drew back slightly to look at her, his expression growing serious again. "Grace Collins, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" "Perhaps," she said, a blush warming her cheeks. "If it's not too soon to consider such things." Wade's hands tightened at her waist. "It's not too soon for me," he said firmly. "I've lived enough of my life to know when something is right, when someone is right. And you, Grace, you are everything I never knew I was looking for." Grace's heart felt so full it might burst. "Then perhaps, Mr. Porter, you should consider asking me a certain question. Not tonight," she added hastily, seeing the look in his eyes. "We both need rest, and there's still much to be done with the outlaws and statements to the sheriff. But soon." Wade nodded, understanding in his gaze. "Soon," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Very soon." They stood together in the warmth of the kitchen for a long moment, neither willing to break the spell of the night to return to the real world that waited beyond the door. But eventually, Wade sighed and stepped back slightly. "You're right about needing rest," he said reluctantly. "And if Mrs. Patterson or Mrs. Henderson finds us here alone, your reputation might suffer more damage than either of us intends." Grace smiled, reaching up to touch his face once more. "Go, sleep. There will be time enough for us tomorrow and the day after and all the days to come." Wade caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm before releasing her. "I'll hold you to that promise, Miss Collins," he said, his eyes warm with love and the promise of a shared future. As he slipped out of the kitchen into the night, Grace stood for a moment in the quiet room, her hand still warm from his touch. 3 days ago, she had been cornered in a barn by men intent on harm, terrified and alone. Now she stood in the same ranch house, her heart full of love for a man who had crossed a line to save her, and in doing so, had changed both their lives forever. Outside, the rain began to ease, the storm passing as storms always do, leaving the world washed clean and ready for a new day to dawn. 3 months later, on a crisp December afternoon, Grace Collins became Grace Porter in a small ceremony at the Silver Creek Church. Mrs. Patterson, beaming with pride, gave the bride away, while Sheriff Tanner stood as Wade's best man. The entire town turned out for the celebration, along with every hand from the Lazy P Ranch. As they exchanged their vows, Grace remembered that moment in the barn, her back against the wall, Thieves closing in, and Wade appearing like an avenging angel in the doorway. "You'll regret crossing this line," he had told them, not knowing then that by crossing that line himself, he was stepping into a future brighter than either of them could have imagined. Later, as they danced together for the first time as husband and wife, Wade whispered in her ear, I still haven't shown you that waterfall." Grace laughed, leaning back to look up at him. "We have all the time in the world now," she reminded him. "That's what marriage means." "All the time in the world," Wade repeated, his eyes full of promises. "And I intend to spend every moment of it making you happy." As the Montana winter settled around them, the Lazy P Ranch became home in a way Grace had never expected when she'd first arrived from Boston. With Wade by her side, the future stretched before them full of possibilities, challenges, and the enduring love that had begun in a moment of danger, but had blossomed into something neither could have imagined. And if sometimes, in the quiet of night, Grace still dreamed of that moment in the barn, it was no longer with fear but with gratitude for the line that had been crossed, for the man who had crossed it, and for the life they now shared together on the wild Montana frontier.